My name's Paul Hart. I'm a professor at Texas State University and the director of the Center for International Studies. I study Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, and I'm happy to be here with you all today. Beautiful venue and a great conference so far. I'm going to read verbatim from the bios that are offered in the program, just in case you don't have one, about both of our speakers today. And I'll introduce both of them. Dr. Buitron will go first, and then Dr. Ramos will follow. And then when they're done, we'll open the floor to questions and answers. And rather than having a formal, summary presentation by myself, we'll just go straight to allowing the audience to participate. And if things get slow, I'll have things to say. Okay, Richard Buitron received his master's degree from Baylor University in 1991 and his PhD from Florida State in 2002. His interest in history begins in March 1836 at the Battle of the Alamo and the death of Jose Toribio Lozoya. Lozoya defended the Alamo because it was his family's home, and his life and death reflect the complexities of Tejano identity at that time. Jose's brother Juan was Buitron's third great-grandfather, so I guess you say great 4 times. His doctoral dissertation, The Quest for Tejano Identity in San Antonio, Texas, was published by Routledge Press. He serves as an adjunct professor of U.S. history at San Antonio College. And Raúl Ramos is associate professor of history at the University of Houston. He received his BA in history and Latin American studies from Princeton and his PhD in history from Yale. He was a fellow at the William Clement Center for Southwest Studies at SMU from 2000 to 2001. And he's the author of Beyond the Alamo, Forging Mexican Ethnicity in San Antonio, 1821 to 1861. A great book if you hadn't read it. The book won the 2009 T.R. Fehrbach Award from the Texas Historical Commission. And Raúl currently serves, and I'm not sure how they got him to do this, as the president-elect of the University of Houston Faculty Senate. All right, Richard.
All right. Well, good afternoon. I just wanted first to introduce my topic by telling you how I became interested in it. I became interested in this topic when I wrote my doctoral dissertation, and I was curious about the intellectual history of San Antonio, especially of the Tejano community in San Antonio. And so at that time, I didn't even know that there was, because my field was in U.S. intellectual history. And at the time, I'm thinking, okay, one of my professors says, why don't you do an intellectual history on San Antonio or South Texas? And I thought, is there an intellectual history? Because at the time, back in the 90s, I didn't know the answer to that question. So I began digging around in the literature. And over time, as I looked at the primary sources, I could see there most definitely was an intellectual history in the early 20th century here in San Antonio. And the catalyst for that intellectual history was the Mexican Revolution. And so there has been a great interest to me, and it remains a great interest to me since that time period. And so without further ado, we can go ahead and begin and really look at the influence of the Mexican Revolution on San Antonio and vice versa, the influence of San Antonio on the Mexican Revolution. And this mural you see over my shoulder, it is a mural in Oaxaca, Mexico, of the leading citizens of Oaxaca. And the person on the extreme left is Ricardo Flores Magón, who came from Oaxaca and was born in Oaxaca, and then moved and spent extensive time here in San Antonio. And so what we see then is we look at figures like Magón and the others that I'll be discussing today, and what we find is that they brought a great deal of their culture, their politics, their political outlook, and their personalities to San Antonio, greatly enriching our community. And let me begin by giving you a little context. into why these figures came to San Antonio. Um, one of the main reasons, of course, if you're familiar with Mexican history, is the presidency of Porfirio Diaz. And Diaz made a number of political changes. Of course, he became the dictator. He was el presidente of Mexico and assumed total control over the Mexican political process. And not only did he assume total control of the political process, he also attempted to transform Mexico economically. And these economic transformations that happened in Mexico became the seedbed for all the dislocation that would begin taking place around 1905 and into the succeeding decades. So what I would like to talk about now then is I would like to um, begin by looking at some of the important figures that came to this city. The first of them being Magon. Here we are. Magon was someone who did not like the injustices that he saw in the Diaz regime. And so he began to try to plot ways of starting a revolution against the regime. One of the ways he did this was moving here to San Antonio and starting a newspaper, Regeneración. And that newspaper was essentially his manifesto against the current status quo in Mexico at that time. Now, as other historians have pointed out, Magon's chief weakness was his lack of political connections both here in the U.S. and in Mexico. He was relatively poor. He did not have very much political clout. And so he had these ideas. He had this what became a program of anarchism that he wanted to push forward and present to the Mexican people. But he had no way really of gathering a large following behind that agenda. And so over time, what Magon did was he attracted the attention of Diaz's agents. And so he ended up having to leave San Antonio. He traveled extensively through the U.S. I believe he was in St. Louis for a time. And then eventually he wound up back in Mexico. But Magon was only the first of many of these important revolutionary figures. Probably the most, I would say, the most influential was Francisco Madero, who came here in 1910. Many of you are already probably familiar with Francisco Madero. He came here, and the reason he did was because of the rigged election that took place in Mexico in 1910. Madero, believing that he was in a legitimate election, found out shortly before the election Diaz becomes a candidate. Diaz wins the election under questionable circumstances. And then Madero is forced, for one part, Madero is imprisoned by Diaz. And he was able to escape from imprisonment. And then Madero came here to San Antonio, where he began setting up a kind of a government in exile. And for approximately a year, Madero was building his contacts on both sides of the border. See, the interesting thing about this whole period of time is there is this tremendous amount of intrigue, which involves U.S. officials, involves Mexican officials, chiefly the Mexican consulate, and the people involved in the revolution. And so there were definitely sectors. There were sectors of our population that were involved in this intrigue. And some of you may know that in 1911, as a resident of San Antonio, Madero came up with his revolutionary plan, his plan de San Luis de Potosí. And that was Madero's plan for reform for Mexico, for his future for the nation. And and so Madero comes up with this plan, and it is modeled largely on the United States, on the political system of the U.S. And so, for a time, then Madero is using his contacts in San Antonio. He is building a resistance against Diaz. But then in 1913, what takes place is that Diaz finally decides to give up his power. He decides to step down from the presidency of Mexico. Diaz steps down. For one thing, Diaz lost his support from the U.S., from the U.S. ambassador and from the U.S. government. And so this was among the many factors that forced him to leave. When Diaz leaves, Madero comes back into Mexico. He then assumes power. He assumes the presidency. What Madero didn't know was he did not really have an appreciation for the complexities of Mexican politics. He did not understand that, for example, there were significant parts of Mexican society that still wanted the old Diaz regime, if not Diaz himself. And that there were those who were constantly plotting against Madero's own presidency. One of these was a Mexican general. Most people who, when they talk about intrigue against Madero, they think obviously of Victoriano Huerta, and he was obviously the main player that had Madero assassinated. However, before Huerta, there was a general by the name of Bernardo Reyes, and Bernardo Reyes, in fact, was an exile from Diaz in his own right. He had been removed by Diaz from the Mexican army because of his popularity. And so Reyes came to the United States in 1913. And by the spring of 1913, General Bernardo Reyes is here in San Antonio. And he is now using San Antonio as his base to plot against Francisco Madero. So this is, like I said, this intrigue has many layers. It's very fascinating. Now, the one question that I've had throughout my research was, how do these Mexican revolutionaries, as they come in and out of San Antonio, I'm thinking, how do they affect San Antonians and the general community? What's the impact of these historical actors on this area? I did find one hint of that, and I found in my reading about Mr. A.J. Chapa. A.J. Chapa was a San Antonio businessman, and he became one of the founders of Chapa's Drugstore, which was here downtown at that time. And Mr. Chapa decided to help General Reyes. He helped him find a residence here in San Antonio. He supplied him with his own money. And so Mr. Chapa played an important role in this plot that Reyes was trying to formulate to get rid of Madero. Reyes was essentially trying to build his own army. He figured he was going to build an army here in Texas and in Mexico. And his plot was, once he got across the border, then he would go ahead and start this plot, and then hopefully overthrow Madero's regime. However, just as with Magon, Reyes Reyes was very quickly discovered by U.S. authorities and by Mexican authorities, chiefly the Mexican consulate. The Mexican consulate also plays a big part in this because, of course, they are hearing about stories first of Magon and now then Madero and now Reyes. Finally, U.S. authorities hear about Reyes, and they believe now that Reyes is actively committing crimes against the United States by trying to start a war against a foreign power from within our borders. And so, essentially, what happens then is U.S. authorities confiscate Reyes's arms. They confiscate his arms. They begin arresting people around him, and they actually put out a warrant for General Reyes's arrest here in the United States. So in late 1913, then Reyes is forced to carry out his plan prematurely. His followers essentially desert him in Mexico, and then his plan comes to nothing. Essentially, his plan falls apart, and he becomes a non-entity. But hearing about Reyes was very fascinating for me because I was able to find out about the support he received from San Antonians. Okay, are we okay with time? Okay, good. We still have time. Excellent. Okay. Another important figure that figures very strongly in San Antonio history is Ignacio Lozano. Ignacio Lozano came to San Antonio around 1912, 1911. And he was not a revolutionary. He was not a general. He ultimately became a journalist. And Lozano decided, when he got here, he decided he wanted to create a Spanish language newspaper. And that newspaper became La Prensa. And La Prensa became just a really important newspaper for San Antonio because it was, in many ways, one of the only Spanish language voices in the city at that time. What is interesting about Lozano, and I told you again that he was not a revolutionary, he was not a general. Lozano was a sympathizer with Diaz, and he strongly believed in a more conservative vision of Mexican politics, of the upper class essentially, running Mexican culture, supervising Mexican politics. This was, in many ways, the attitude that he took in his editorials that he wrote. Now, what is very fascinating about La Prensa is what Lozano does with it. He begins to collect Mexican intellectuals. He begins collecting Mexican intellectuals who were all kicked out during the course of this revolution. And they become kind of the focus, if you will, for the newspaper. This newspaper, La Prensa, becomes their voice. And over time, they kind of tried to assume cultural leadership. Excuse me. Thank you. They try to assume cultural leadership of the Tejano community. In many ways are similar to the way that the Canary Islanders did the same 2 centuries earlier when they arrived. And so in many ways, La Prensa then becomes this voice, but it is, in many respects, a pan-Mexican voice. Now, what do I mean when I say that? What I mean is that Lozano was hoping not just to be the voice of San Antonio, not just to be the voice of Tejanos. He wanted to be the voice of the entire Mexican community on both sides of the border. And reading his newspaper even today makes for very fascinating reading, because you're hearing about all of the events occurring of the early 20th century from his perspective, and the sheer language. The Spanish itself was beautiful Spanish, and the emotion that they invest in just in the journalistic part of the newspaper is very incredible. And so, in its own right, La Prensa was a tremendous journalistic work. And so, the other thing, though, I need to mention about La Prensa, and this is what I found in my dissertation, was that he was trying to lead Tejanos in a culturally and politically Mexican direction. He wanted to fix their identity in Mexico, not in the United States. Why do I point this out? I point it out because of the fact that many of the people working at La Prensa at the time, their children would become the leaders of this community. For example, the father of Henry V. Gonzalez was a contributor to La Prensa. And the Munguia family, who also were exiles, who were contributors to La Prensa, of course, were the parents and grandparents of Henry Cisneros. And this is ironic because the second generation, this is true of a lot of immigrants, in fact, all immigrants, you see the second generation leading their community then in a much more Americanized direction, in a much more willingness to assimilate and integrate into that population. So, like I said, in many ways, Lozano's intellectualism turns out to be rather ironic. So I feel I need to point that out. Okay, in the time I have left, I just want to briefly mention one other event which is often overlooked, which I believe played a very big role in the identity of Tejanos in the early 20th century. And that event was the Plan de San Diego, which did not happen in San Antonio. It occurred down in the Rio Grande Valley in 1915. Now, time doesn't allow me to get into all the details of what occurred of this. What essentially happened in early 1915, January of 1915, Mexican revolutionaries were plotting to overthrow the Texas government. And they were doing this because of racial tension that was taking place in South Texas at that time, the growing discrimination that was occurring in the area. And so they said, we're going to come in here. We're going to kill all Anglo men over the age of 16. And so there begin to be these murders that begin to happen on the Texas border. But what is doubly tragic about the Plan de San Diego is the backlash that happens. Because the backlash is something which we are still grappling with today. The intervention of the Texas Rangers. And the Rangers, volunteers hired by the Rangers, go down to Brownsville, go down to parts of the Rio Grande Valley, and they essentially start killing every Mexican they can find, on the pretext that all these men are part of the Plan de San Diego. And the turmoil that this creates was obvious. There was real fear among Tejanos, many of whom had lived here for generations, that they were no longer safe in Texas. Many of them fled to Mexico to get away from the Rangers. Now, ultimately what ended up happening was the U.S. Army had to be called out. The U.S. Army had to be called out to restore order in the valley and to protect Tejanos and other citizens from the Texas Rangers. Now, why do I point this out? Because this isn't directly germane to us, but in a way it is. It is germane because this hovers in the background of San Antonio's identity for the rest of the early 20th century. Not often discussed, but it is always there. Now, let me say one other thing too about this. Now, the impact of the revolution. According to the U.S. Census, there were approximately 90,000 citizens of San Antonio. In 1920, there were over 160,000 people living in San Antonio, a population increase of over 50%. Much of that growth, according to T.R. Feuerbach, was due to the violence of the Mexican Revolution. So, definitely, the revolution plays a huge role in the development of the city. Unfortunately, what we don't know is how directly does the Mexican Revolution affect San Antonians. This is an area where I think it's a very fertile area for investigation because, honestly, we don't have a clear answer to it yet. There aren't a lot of articles out there, works out there dealing with this topic, and I think it's something that we need to dig in much further and see if we can find primary sources of maybe diaries of those who lived back then. But as of right now, we don't have a lot of information about people living around Francisco Madero. What did they think of Madero when he lived here in San Antonio? What did they think of General Bernardo Reyes? What did they think of Ignacio Lozano? How do these people affect the lives of everyday Tejanos? That is a question that we're going to have to be looking into in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Hopefully, I'll write an article about that. But you're right. This is the million-dollar question. Directly to your answer, what do you think? What did Francisco Madero's neighbors think? Oh, thanks. I don't know how many. I don't know if his neighbors would have known he was there altogether. I have a quick question before I begin, because this is sort of my point. Raise your hand? Who could tell me when the next presidential election in Mexico will be held? Who knows? How many of you know when's the next election in Mexico for president? When? July of this year, right? Okay. Number two, does anybody know anything about any of the candidates running for president in Mexico? Or even how many candidates are running that have a realistic chance of winning? Anybody? 4? 3? So there are 3, actually. And there's a lot of hand-wringing and consternation right now. There's a candidate who's running for the 3rd time, and folks are worried that he's going to be the next Chavez in Venezuela, and then again, we were worried about our presidential election last year, and so I'm not terribly worried. But my point here is we're not that far from Mexico here in San Antonio, right? You should know this. And certainly the readers of Lozano's paper of La Prensa and later La Opinión in Los Angeles knew this. The Mexican community continues to know this. There's a broad, when I say Mexican community today in San Antonio, you're talking, the entire sweep of the city. And from folks that have been here, since before Americans arrived to folks that just came as a result of recent violence and economic uncertainty in Mexico. So this is a story that has always been part of the San Antonio story, and the Mexican Revolution is a great place to look at how folks are dealing with that at that time. I want to expand a bit on some of the observations that Dr. Buitron raised to talk about the Mexican community in San Antonio during the Mexican Revolution in order to get a sense of how people reacted to the changing nature of borders, nations, and nationalism. My interest is in understanding what it meant to be of Mexican descent in San Antonio at the turn of the century. The Mexican Revolution is useful as it's an opportunity to see Mexican identity at work in San Antonio, both in terms of its connection to Mexico, as well as to the connection of being American. In other words, this is another way of being American, not just Mexican American, but at the end we'll talk about other ethnic groups looking at sort of home nations and the way living in the United States is a place where you can have continue that involvement with that nation. So first, let me begin with San Antonio before the Revolution, at the turn of the century. At the close of the 19th century, San Antonio was part of a larger demographic and economic boom in the American Southwest. Much of this was driven by federal government support of railroads, irrigation, and military development. San Antonio stood poised to gain from all these forms of growth. San Antonio served as a link to the breadbasket of South Texas and the growth of the military from beginning with the Civil War and before, you could argue. So the federal government's actively developing the economy of the West and of the Southwest, and San Antonio is a key part of that growth. San Antonio and South Texas also benefited from a fairly open border. Prior to the Mexican Revolution, the border was primarily a place where commerce was controlled and taxed. Import duties served as a source of revenue for the government and protected internal industries. Families would come and go in a fairly unrestricted manner. And certainly, when you look at San Antonio and most of Texas, you would see that. Here we go. You would see that you would have families that would go back and forth, mainly because of marriages, or an opportunity, or somebody dies and you go back and take over the ranch, or you would have multiple crossings of that border. Again, prior to 1848, but even into the turn of the century. Now, I might take issue with the question about how much the Mexican Revolution really changed the demographics of San Antonio and of the Southwest in terms of Mexican population. Certainly, a lot of people did come from Mexico at that time, but I want to argue that they were already coming before that. And because of this growth in the Southwest, because of the economic development in this area, and because of Diaz's policies beforehand, right? They were leaving, they were dispossessed from ejidos and so forth. And so so in some ways that is a direct relation to one of the causes of the Mexican Revolution. But certainly this is a growth that was already taking place. And if we look at San Antonio, you see that the angle of increase of Bexar County really takes off around 1900. So it's kind of plugging away there at steady growth, and then it really jumps. You want to see an even more amazing graph. Look at Los Angeles during this time period. I mean, it blows San Antonio out of the water in terms of growth. And a lot of that growth is from other parts of the United States, but it's also from Mexico, and it's also from other parts of the world coming to San Antonio, to Texas, and to the Southwest. Now, what I want to do is turn to the Revolution. And the place I want to begin, actually, I should have made the font smaller for Centenario there to fit it in one slide here. A place to begin is the Centennial of Mexican Independence, 1910. This was a critical moment, and many folks would point to 1910 is the beginning of the Mexican Revolution, at least that, and so we have a couple of things going on here. In particular, you have Porfirio Diaz looking to capitalize on the centennial in 1910 as a way to modernize Mexico and to make it and to put it on an equal footing with nations around the world. But what I want to do is focus on the Centenario in terms of what it meant to the people in the American Southwest and in San Antonio in particular. The Mexican Revolution requires historians to connect various activities between the U.S. and Mexico. And what I want to emphasize today is that not all immigrant histories are the same, yet they all occupy a common position in American political and social identity. Typically, the focus of the Mexican Revolution on ethnic Mexicans has either examined political exile groups or refugees escaping the violence in large numbers. While many considered the exile temporary, their presence resulted in a permanent demographic shift along the borderlands marked in this period. Not coincidentally, shortly after the onset of the revolution, American border and immigration policy also changed to constrict and harden the sometimes fluid national borderline. Yet marking this shift in its dramatic fashion obscures the continuities and already established identities of Mexican communities on the American side, present from before American conquest. While these communities experienced a transformation resulting from the Mexican exile migration, their transborder and transnational practices and self-identity make sense within this the ways they participated in the Mexican Revolution. That participation spanned a spectrum from being informed, just knowing what's happening, keeping up with the contours of Mexican national politics, to articulating a position on the war, to providing direct support to combatants in Mexico or exiles within their communities. Without minimizing the real differences between more established ethnic Mexicans in the U.S. and the revolutionary generation, looking at the actions of longtime communities during the war eliminates what it would mean to be an American of Mexican descent in this historical place at such a charged moment. One early location of this national articulation is in the Tricentennial. Ethnic Mexican communities in towns and cities across the American Southwest held Mexican Independence Day parades in conjunction with the Tricentennial. The Tricentennial Commission, which was a federal commission in Mexico, sent a representative to coordinate and oversee these celebrations, witnessing firsthand the desire of local communities to connect with the national moment in Mexico. The Tricentennial Commission solicited Romero Palafox. I'll leave it on this one. We'll go here. To Romero Palafox to investigate these organizations in South Texas, and he wrote back with his report in October of 1909. He wrote, "I went to Texas on my own initiative. There I spoke of the Mexican nation to humble workers of those border areas. And while I believe that 70 years of banishment had extinguished any trace of patriotism, I found noble Mexican souls filled with a fervent love of their homeland, their patria, augmented and transmitted from generation to generation, as do all people who are oppressed by their conqueror." Palafox felt the Centenario would have a deeper transformative power in the borderlands. He made Tejano participation integral to reforming the borderlands, particularly with the threat that it posed to Mexico. He couched these, he couched these in a larger history of this Mexican population. He saw that Mexicanos and Tejanos who have been here are a bulwark against foreign intervention and radical change. Palafox believed the Centenario celebrations in the borderlands might inspire some Tejanos to travel to Mexico to see their country firsthand. This would counter negative ideas about Diaz and the rumors of widespread oppression. By taking an active role in promoting the Centenario in Texas and by understanding surveillance and undertaking surveillance on the American side, Mexican government demonstrated concern for the thoughts and actions of the greater Mexican population. Now, what about these celebrations? And they're taking place throughout the Southwest. And by the way, they have been since Mexican independence, right? The Centenario celebrations in San Antonio serve as one example of how we see that the Mexican population is not a singular population, but rather a fragmented, diverse group of people. So in the case of San Antonio in 1910, you actually had two parades. And that celebrated Centenario. One group, led by the Grand International League of Mexico, held its function in the Central Park, while the other, composed of several mutualistas and the Gran Liga Mexicana, held theirs in San Pedro Park. The festival in San Pedro Park seemed better attended, due perhaps to the larger membership and population base of support of the sponsoring group. Also, prior to the split, San Antonio's Tejanos usually held their main independence celebration in San Pedro Park. By 1917, in the midst of the Mexican Revolution, class divisions between the celebrations became more apparent as Mexican elites held their Independence Day celebrations at the casino, highlighted by singing of arias, operatic arias, and ballroom dancing to a full orquesta. Other year celebrations put the Centenario events in perspective. Before 1910, in 1895, over 5,000 attended a closing evening dance and fireworks at San Pedro Park. By the turn of the century, the festival had transformed into a civic event that incorporated the entire city, regardless of ethnicity. Of the 1895 celebration, the San Antonio Daily Express noted, to judge from the nationality of the people who were on the grounds, it would be hard to tell exactly what kind of celebration was in progress. It seemed 16 de septiembre had established itself as a significant civic celebration in San Antonio that extended beyond just the Mexican community. In the 1909 celebration, there was some early anticipation for the upcoming Centenario. The newspaper noted, the Mexican colony of San Antonio has been led to look toward Mexico with more attention because of the preparation there for the celebration of the centennial of Mexican independence next year. But already a split in the festival planning had appeared at that point. La Orden the Amigos del Pueblo organizing the events in San Pedro Springs, and the Junta Patriótica Popular preparing for Electric Park. Electric Park being important here because, again, at least for Diaz, this also led to the electrification of Mexico. He built Latin America's largest power plant just for the Centenario, and there is the Palacio Nacional in the Zócalo lit up for the first time in 1910. And the Junta Patriótica Popular comprised mainly of Mexican social and labor organizations, planned their evening with speeches in English and in Spanish, poems, and the recitation of the Mexican Declaration of Independence, the Grito de Independencia. In both instances, prominent men and women of the Mexican community read their speeches and their poems. The following day, the San Antonio Express described both events while smoothing over the potential conflict of Mexican patriotism in the U.S. The paper wrote, the Mexicans of San Antonio were urged to be better citizens of the United States in order that they may live as worthy sons of their forefathers who left them the same proud heritage which the heroes of 1776 gave to the people of the United States. Thus, the Mexican flag and the American flag. Really, the only difference between U.S. and Mexico are just different hats on the eagles, as far as I can tell. But this is a way that there was an attempt, at least within the English language newspaper, to create these links. The newspaper described the decorations of Mexican and American flags intertwined at both parks and speeches made in English and Spanish. Bands played melodies of both national anthems, changing in the middle of a bar. The theme of entwined banners and equating Mexican and American independence repeated in almost all the parades of the U.S. So we don't see this just in San Antonio, and even some ceremonies in Mexico City. All after both revolutions did represent. After all, both represented post. European colonialism. And although I will note that there is much less, there was more room for Spanish identity or the Spanish past in the Mexican celebration than, say, British past in the American celebration. We still don't see July 4th as a British moment to celebrate being British heritage. Like the 1909 parade, the Centennial Parade in 1910 included several American Army regiments marching along with city officials, Mexican delegates, and nearly all the Mexican mutual societies of the city. The parade route wound through San Antonio from Milan Square to San Pedro Park. On the occasion of the Centennial Parade, the Daily Express observed that the reception by both Americans and Mexicans on the street traversed by the American troops was notably enthusiastic. Following behind the soldiers came leaders from the wide variety of Mexican organizations, such as the Gran Círculo de Obreros, the Unión Sociedad Ignacio Allende, and the Club de Trabajadores. While two celebrations were held in 1910, one moved from Electric Park to Central Park. In each of these celebrations, fandangos were held in both parks until late at night. For the Centenario, the group set up food and drink stalls, games of chance, and dancing pavilions that, quote, presented a gay scene. On the final evening of the week-long festivities, the celebration included fireworks and the tricolor of the Mexican flag. Once again, speeches and poems moved those in attendance. The newspaper noted, Pablo Fernandez spoke of the history of Mexico and the rise of that republic to be a power in the Western Hemisphere. Miss Morales recited a poem called 1896 to 1910, written by Juan de Dios Pesa, which was well received. Hortensia Cisneros recited an original poem called What a Mexican Can Do. The little miss was cheered to the echo. Several elements stand out from the San Antonio Centenario. The most striking is the inclusion of American symbols in English language, as well as Anglo-American participation in the festivities. The diversity suggests that the event became a civic holiday reflecting Anglo-American acceptance of Mexican people and history. The fact that the two celebrations developed during the period did not deter Anglo-American participation. But the differences between the two groups points to social and political conflicts within the ethnic Mexican community. While support or opposition to Diaz's government played a role, class or even migrant generation might have also affected that split. For Anglo-Americans, the parade celebrated an American subculture. For ethnic Mexicans, the parade served as a space to debate ideas about the Mexican past, present, and future. These debates also surface again in Laredo and in Los Angeles. Now, let me turn briefly to an example of a family that comes out of Laredo, Nuevo Laredo and Laredo, the Idar family. In particular, I'm going to talk about Clemente Idar and Jovita Idar, both of whom are active in Mexican-American politics in Laredo during the Mexican Revolution, and both of who write about this in Spanish language press, and particularly in La Crónica, that's published in Laredo, beginning at the turn of the century. Clemente was born in 1883. He goes on to become a labor leader in Texas, becomes a close friend of Samuel Gompers, and as a result, he has kind of a conflicted perspective with Mexican workers, right? The AFL and Gompers were restrictionist. They believed that increased Mexican labor force threatened American labor and Native American labor, as they would have described it. And so Idar was sort of walking this line that many labor leaders up until Chavez, even Cesar Chavez, had to walk around the question of how do you support the Mexican community who's here, and also deal with this question of controlling the labor supply, but worker control of the labor supply versus sort of employer control of the labor supply. Nevertheless, Clemente Idar also reported on the Mexican Revolution and gave what he felt was a critique of, at least early on, of how the American press was mischaracterizing the Mexican Revolution. He wrote, "El pueblo mexicano no quiere guerra, quiere trabajo, industrias, quiere ilustración, hacerse fuerte ejerciendo sus derechos, pero no quiere aniquilarse a sí mismo." They don't, that war is the last thing people want. They want jobs, they want work, they want fair economic development. And he saw that was an important part of the Mexican Revolution, and that's the part that the Flores Magón brothers brought with them as they both organized around the Mexican Revolution, but really organized around anarcho-syndicalism throughout the Southwest. That's really why they think they were put in Fort Leavenworth. It was the threat that they held at that point. Jovita Idar, Clemente's sister, also participated in the newspaper, but she also participated in social organizing. In September 14th, 1911, 1 year after the Centenario, a group of social and civil rights organizations organized in Laredo and called themselves the Congreso Mexicanista. And Jovita Idar and the Idars were leaders in this movement. The Congreso Mexicanista then essentially started turning to internal social issues affecting the Mexican community. So here's one of the links I want to make. How did organizing around the revolution in Mexico then also turn to essentially in supporting or energizing the Mexican community within the United States to also demand those kinds of improvements and those kinds of reforms for themselves in San Antonio and throughout the Southwest of the United States. Jovita Idar goes on to marry Bartolo Juarez. They moved to San Antonio in 1917, and she becomes very active in the Democratic Party in San Antonio as well, and continues to write, continues to advocate for educational reform in San Antonio. And so the entire Idar family becomes critical to this, becomes sort of a link to this early generation and to the later generation. I'll very quickly mention one other place where you see this kind of borderland Mexicano participating in the Mexican Revolution. In this case, the organizing of Lenor Villegas de Magnon, who begins to treat soldiers that were wounded, particularly in Carranza's army, in 1913 in Laredo, and then actually goes into Mexico and begins to treat those wounded from during the Mexican Revolution, and essentially becomes the what's known as the Cruz Blanca, the Red Cross, if you will, for Mexico. So where does this leave us? I want to focus, again, the Mexican Revolution is important here for the Mexican community and for the entire Southwest for two reasons. First, I want to point out that this kind of activism, interest in what's happening in Mexico, is as American as apple pie. Ethnic Americans have been doing this for as long as the United States has been a country. In this case, right at the same period that the Mexican Revolution is taking place, you have Irish organizing under the under Irish republicanism, organizing dances, raising money. Here you have the Irish flag and the American flag in one of these balls, and I think this one's in 1914. And then you also have Chinese organizing for the nationalist revolution against the emperor in Chinatowns in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York City, organizing for these revolutions. So that brings up the question: what is that connection? How does being in the U.S. essentially become a place for raising funds, for supporting these revolutions, but also maintaining that kind of involvement with the nation? Now, clearly for Mexico, that connection is right next door. But it also has there's a second way that the Mexican Revolution affects San Antonio and the Mexican population in the Southwest. It's as Dr. Buitron noted, you have the increase of a middle-class population. You have the increase of different forms of cultural expression, in this case, orquestas that are formed after the Mexican Revolution. Richard Garcia wrote about this in his book on the Mexican middle class in San Antonio. But essentially what you have is the closing of the U.S.-Mexico border. That in many ways, a couple of things happen during this time. You have the militarization of the Border Patrol. You have the control of people moving back and forth, not just goods and objects. And finally, you have immigration, restrictive immigration laws that are passed by the U.S. Congress in 1917 that set quotas and limits on who could come into the United States. What does this do? And much of that, in terms of Mexico, is put in terms of chaos and order. In other words, what's across the border is chaotic, of course, because that's where the war is happening. And we need to close the border in order to keep the chaos off our land. And certainly you have a lot of that taking place, for instance, during the Villa's raid on Columbus, for instance. That becomes a key way of describing all of Mexico and Mexicans. But what this does is it also makes the Mexican population who is here realize that back and forth isn't happening anymore, and you have a refocusing of the work that needs to be done and around being permanently here and supporting your community and supporting and becoming active in the larger population, and one that's becoming in some ways a little less transnational than it was before. Thank you.
Okay, so I said I wasn't going to say anything, but these guys raised a whole bunch of things, so now I'm going to say something real briefly. First, with Dr. Buitron's presentation, it's just obvious to all of us, I'm sure, that the Mexican Revolution, and if you study art or literature, you know these things, but was a catalyst for intellectual and artistic expression in mural art, exploration of everything indigenous, in cuisine, in literature, in the expression of radical political alternatives, and ideas for how to reorganize society and how to redistribute wealth, and in ideas of human rights and the portability of those. So I think those are some of the things that you see all expressed in the San Antonio experience, right, by both Mexicans and new Mexican Americans. And then one thing that I thought was really important with Raúl's presentation, Dr. Ramos points out that this matters over time, that Mexican migration spiked in 1900, not 1910, which is really important for understanding not just the revolution, but the forces behind migration and immigration in general over time. So, for example, migration, both legal and illegal, spiked dramatically from Mexico to the United States from the years 1995 to 2005 in a really dramatic way, and in a way that's totally different than now, right? because of the social and economic dislocation created by NAFTA. And in fact, between 2014 and today, 2018, more Mexicans have left the United States than have come to the United States, which is reflected, I guess, in President Trump's idiosyncratic behavior, which little did you know, the border wall is actually designed to keep Mexicans in. Right? Okay, I'll open the floor to questions. Any questions or comments for either speaker? Yes, sir.
I'm just curious if you did any investigation on the Spanish flu epidemic. The Spanish flu epidemic a pandemic of 1918, did it have an impact on the revolution in Mexico, on the leadership that maybe got killed off or had an effect?
To my knowledge, no. I know that it was a worldwide situation. It was a worldwide pandemic, and but any connection to the revolution itself, I've never seen anything. I mean, Dr. Ramos, he may have different information on that.
If you, I want to make a pitch for Dr. Hart's colleague, John McKiernan Gonzalez, who has a book on the the medicalization and health control on the Texas-Mexico border, particularly around this time and particularly around these diseases. This is working. And one of the things he notes is actually that moment, he's concentrating more on the U.S. side. And in the U.S. side, that's the moment you get the nationalization of the creation, if you will, of the National Health Service. So the National Health Service kind of goes hand in hand with immigration control. Now, a side effect of that is I don't know if that's not a great term there, is that you also have a racialization of health. That Mexicans, it goes along with a narrative of Mexicans being somehow more diseased and more polluted, and again, becomes another reason for militarizing the border at this period. Dr. Ramos might also have another comment on that.
The Mexican Revolution created approximately 1 million deaths. That's what it was. Did they die of violence? No. They died of the flu epidemic of 1918, so-called Spanish flu, but it was originated in Kansas. So
Yeah.
I think that is important because the oral history of towns in Mexico that see the old people looking at the cars full of cadavers going to the cemetery, it was the common thing. Right. So it was a pandemic. One question is that I think is important for the presenters is there any data on the amount of money that these people from Mexico during the revolution brought to the banks in San Antonio, the Frost Bank, the Gross Bank, the Alamo National Bank? Did they have big deposits from people from Mexico at the time? What happened to that money? Did they go back? Did they stay here? What was the economical impact? Because that's what you're talking about, what happened to San Antonio during the revolution. What was the influx of money? Was that the same that happens just before a devaluation in Mexico? Or what is it?
Yeah, I was just going to say the safe haven is San Antonio and San Diego in real estate, right? Whenever there's an economic crisis in Mexico, Mexicans send their money north, logically, if they can, right? But I don't know anyone that's investigated that. So that's an excellent question. Do either panelists have any information on that?
No, that's a fascinating idea.
I don't have amounts, but certainly, again, I'll make a pitch to my colleague, John Mason Hart, whose book on the last grand work.
Empire and Revolution.
Empire and Revolution traces more of those funds going to New York City. But I will say both in terms of and London, if you will. But I will say both in terms of epidemics and in terms of capital flows, if you will, this is the case since the 1830s, right? You have the cholera epidemic in Texas having an equally devastating effect on the Mexican population and the population of the entire border region that has a cascading effect of really destabilizing the region and and making it more possible to have the kind of radical change that you have by 1835, 1836. And so, and not to mention, the border wealth created in the Civil War period, where the King Ranch is making their money. There's all these we see that there's a massive transfer of wealth that's taking place in South Texas from after the 1830s into certainly up until the Revolution. That's some of the source for the Plan de San Diego, the violence around the Plan de San Diego around 1915.
All right, well, I've been informed that our time is officially up, but if people have questions, I'm sure our presenters would be happy to talk with you, and if you want to know more about certain topics, I'm sure they'd be happy to share sources and places to investigate those things on your own. Thank you very much.